Fog sits low over 80 acres of bluegrass and clover, the kind of morning where you can hear a tractor 2 farms away before you ever see it. A hand rests on a weathered wooden gate. The latch is rusted, but it still works, because someone oils it every spring, the same way it's been done since 1961. This gate used to open onto 300 acres of rotational pasture. Today, it opens onto a 9-hole practice green. Somewhere past the tree line, a sprinkler system hisses to life on cue, watering bent grass that didn't exist 5 years ago. And somewhere in a farmhouse kitchen, less than a quarter mile from the 7th tee box, a woman named Elmer Whitfield is pulling a cast-iron Dutch oven out of a 1978 gas oven. And the smell of braised short ribs is about to change the way an entire golf club thinks about Sunday afternoons. This is the story of how a pasture became a punchline and then became the reason grown men in golf shoes started calling in favors just to get a seat at her table. Carol Ann's grandfather, Elmer Whitfield, bought this land in 1958 with a GI loan and a herd of 11 Angus cross cattle. Angus cattle were prized then for the same reason they're prized now. They finish well on grass alone. They calve easy, and their marbling holds up in a way that dairy beef crosses simply can't match. Elmer wasn't a scientist. He was a man with a notebook, and in that notebook he kept records most modern agronomists would recognize instantly: which paddock got grazed which week, how long the grass needed to rest before cattle came back through it, and how the clover seemed to come back thicker every year in the paddocks he rested longest. What Elmer was practicing, without ever using the phrase, was rotational grazing, moving cattle through fenced sections of pasture in a planned sequence so that no single patch of grass is ever grazed down to the root. Grass, unlike a lot of crops, doesn't die when you cut it. It regenerates from stored energy in its root system, but only if you leave enough leaf area behind for photosynthesis to keep feeding those roots. Graze it too short too often, and the roots shrink along with the grass, the soil compacts, and the whole pasture starts to die from the ground up. Elmer figured this out with a fence, a clipboard, and 11 cows. It took modern soil science until the 1980s to catch up and put a name to what he was already doing: holistic planned grazing, a term coined by the ecologist Alan Savory, describing almost exactly Elmer's paddock rotations. By the time Carol Ann was old enough to help him move fence line, the farm had grown to 300 acres and 60 head. She remembers walking the fence rows barefoot every June, checking for gaps a calf might squeeze through, her grandfather 2 steps behind her, explaining why the clover in paddock 4 always came in thicker than paddock 2. Clover, he told her, doesn't need nitrogen fertilizer the way corn does, because clover roots host a bacteria called rhizobium in small nodules that pull nitrogen straight out of the air and convert it into a form the plant can use. When the clover eventually gets grazed or dies back, that nitrogen releases into the soil for the grass around it to use. It's not folklore. It's the nitrogen cycle, running quietly under a cattle pasture, the same way it's run under legume fields for 10,000 years of agriculture. Elmer Whitfield passed away in 2009. He left the farm to his son, and eventually, in 2018, it passed to Carol Ann, the only one of his grandchildren who ever wanted to stay. The letter came in March of 2021. A regional development group had been buying up land 2 miles outside town for the better part of 3 years, parcel by parcel, and they'd finally reached the ridge that bordered the Whitfield property. The offer was for 110 acres, the back third of the farm, the rolling section along the creek that Elmer always called the far pasture, because it took the longest to walk to. Carol Ann didn't want to sell, but the math told a different story than her heart did. Property taxes on agricultural land had climbed every year for a decade. Equipment repairs on a 40-year-old baler don't get cheaper, and the 200 acres she'd keep could still run a profitable cow-calf operation if she restructured her grazing plan. She sold the back third. The development group broke ground on what would become Ridgeline Creek Golf and Country Club 18 months later. She watched from her back porch as the far pasture, Elmer's far pasture, got graded, seeded with a golf-specific bentgrass blend, and irrigated with more water in a single week than her cattle used in a month. She watched the creek get rerouted around what would become the 12th hole. She watched a clubhouse go up where the old hay barn used to stand, Its foundation poured almost exactly where the barn's foundation had been, because it turned out to be the only flat, well-drained ground on the whole property, something the developer's engineers discovered with soil surveys, and something Elmer had simply known by walking it. For the first year the club was open, Carol Ann didn't set foot on it. Members would occasionally wander the property line with a wedge and a stray ball, and she'd wave, polite but distant. She kept farming the 200 acres she had left. She kept the notebook going, the same way her grandfather had. It started, as these things usually do, by accident. In the fall of 2023, Carol Ann's beef processor had a scheduling mix-up, and she ended up with 400 extra pounds of ground beef and short ribs in her chest freezer, with nowhere to go before the next batch came in. Rather than let it sit, she posted in the local community group, "Sunday supper at the farmhouse, $5 a plate, bring your own chair." 12 people showed up. She served braised short ribs over stone-ground grits, a recipe that had been in Elmer's mother's handwriting since before Carol Ann was born, along with green beans from her own garden and cornbread made with buttermilk from a neighbor's dairy. Word got around slower than a wildfire, but just as certain. By the third Sunday, 40 people showed up. By December, she'd moved supper into the old equipment shed, cleared out and strung with shop lights, because the farmhouse dining room couldn't hold the crowd anymore. Somewhere around the 5th or 6th Sunday, 3 members from Ridgeline Creek, still in their golf shoes, spikes and all, having wandered over after a Sunday round to see what the smell was, sat down at a folding table and ate short ribs that had been raised, in a very real sense, on the same soil their golf course now sat beside. One of them, a retired contractor named Walter Briggs, came back the next week, and the week after that. By spring of 2024, Walter wasn't the only member skipping his Sunday tea time. The pro shop started noticing a real dip in Sunday afternoon bookings, and when the club manager asked around, he got the same answer from 4 different members. "I'm going to the supper." Here's the part that matters. The part that's easy to miss if you just chalk it up to good cooking. Carol Ann's Sunday suppers worked because of the actual agricultural relationship between the farm and the table, not just in spite of it. The Angus cattle she raises are what's called a grass-finished herd for most of the year, meaning they spend the majority of their life eating pasture forage rather than a grain-heavy feedlot diet. Grass-finished beef has a documented difference in fatty acid composition compared to conventionally grain-finished beef. Research from land-grant universities, including Texas A&M and Colorado State, has repeatedly shown higher concentrations of omega-3 fatty acids and conjugated linoleic acid in beef, from cattle, finished primarily on pasture. It's not a marketing claim. It's measurable in a lab, and it changes the flavor too. Grass-finished beef tends to have a more mineral, slightly gamier depth that short, hot braises, like Elmer's mother's recipe, are specifically built to soften and round out. The vegetables came from a garden built on soil that had been under rotational grazing for over 60 years, meaning organic matter content in that soil was measurably higher than the surrounding cropland. A well-documented outcome of long-term managed grazing, since decomposing root mass and manure both contribute organic carbon back into the topsoil far more effectively than annual tillage does. Higher organic matter means better water retention, better microbial activity, and often better flavor development in the vegetables grown in it, something home gardeners and small-scale market farmers have observed anecdotally for generations, and soil scientists have increasingly been able to quantify. None of the golf club members necessarily knew the biology behind why the food tasted the way it did, but they could taste that it was different, and once Carol Ann started telling the story of her grandfather's notebook, the story of the far pasture, the story of nitrogen-fixing clover and grass roots, and 60 years of patient stewardship, the meal stopped being just a meal. It became a direct line back to land. They now looked out at every Sunday from the fairway. By the summer of 2024, the club's general manager, a woman named Deborah Ash, drove over unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon. Carol Ann was out repairing fence, the same kind of fence work she'd done barefoot as a kid, and Deborah made her an offer nobody expected. The club wanted to formally partner with the farm, a standing order for beef and produce to supply the clubhouse restaurant, a covered pavilion built at the shared property line so Sunday suppers could run rain or shine, and equal billing on the club's own marketing materials. Carol Ann said yes on one condition: The suppers stayed $5 a plate for anyone from town, member or not. Deborah didn't hesitate. Today, Ridgeline Creek Golf and Country Club still has 18 holes, still has a beautiful clubhouse, and still books plenty of Saturday tea times. But Sunday afternoons belong to Carol Ann Whitfield's supper, now regularly feeding upward of 150 people, under a pavilion built at the edge of what used to be her grandfather's far pasture. Members show up in golf clothes because they came straight from the ninth hole. Neighbors show up in work boots because they came straight from their own farms. Elmer's notebook, the actual physical coffee-stained notebook, sits under glass in the pavilion now, open to a page from 1974, where he wrote down the exact date the clover in paddock 4 came back thicker than he'd ever seen it. Elmer Whitfield never got to see a golf course go up on his land. He never got to see his granddaughter feed 150 people on a Sunday afternoon, or watch grown men trade a tea time for a folding chair and a plate of short ribs. But everything that makes those suppers worth showing up for, the grass, the cattle, the soil, the clover, the patient decades of a rotation he mapped out with a pencil and a fence line, that's still his. It never stopped being his. The golf course changed what the land looked like. It never changed what the land was. And every Sunday, when the last plate gets cleared and the shop lights get switched off over the pavilion, Carol Ann walks the same fence line her grandfather walked, checking the same gaps a calf might squeeze through, in the same boots, on the same 200 acres that never got sold. Some things, it turns out, are worth more than the back 9.